I'm not saying digital twins or any of the industrial parts will kind of save us or make our lives easier. For me, it was just interesting to look at what we are doing in our industry with a different lens.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 150, Diagrams as Code. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, we made it to 150.
Okay, that's still, like 6% of the target 1,000?
I don't know what the math is. Well, actually, I should
15.
be able to do the math. 150 is 6%. Sure, why not? 1,000. I need to figure out, doing the real math, when we will hit episode 1,000. What date in the future?
Will we be alive?
I hope so. I hope so. And you may be hearing a third voice. And if we do make it to 1,000, this voice will also be on there. We have Patrick Debois back with us. Patrick, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations, right?
Thank you. That would mean...
That would have been a cake normally with candles, but yeah.
Yep. So Patrick comes on every Divide by 50 episode except for the 0 episode. So that means when we make it, not if we, but when we make it to 1,000, that means you would have been on 20 times.
Wow. Okay.
And I think that would have been, I think the round number at 1,000 is roughly 18 years. It's somewhere in that ballpark. So we'll see. 18, I'll be old. How old would I be in 18 years? Well, we're at 3, so 15, I can do the math easier. 15, I'll be 70. So, yeah.
Is there an expression of older, and then once you're old, can you even become older? Like, it's old, right?
Ancient.
Ancient. Yeah, ancient. Good point. We'll be ancient.
No, I think if you're going for ancient, you have to be like Methuselah level, 700 plus years old. That's ancient, I think. Anything sub 700, you're just old.
Yeah. Remember us listening back to the first episode, think like, what were we thinking those years? Right? It's like, yeah.
Actually, I say that for everything I did or said more than a year ago, kind of. Was I really telling people to do this?
Wait, you're saying a year ago? I thought that was just a week ago.
I don't know. A year. I'm more mature now, so I think more in advance.
Okay.
You're planning things. Congratulations.
Exactly.
So Patrick's been poking and prodding on a number of new things. Now, just in case you don't know who Patrick is, the normal line, which he tends to roll his eyeballs at, is he's considered the godfather of DevOps. And of course, we keep saying there is no such thing as DevOps, but so that means we're going against the godfather. So does that mean we're going to have a horse head next to us when we wake up in the morning? I don't know. But over the past year, I've been watching him just off the time because roughly it's every 50 it's actually every 50 episodes he comes on, which is about once a year. He's been doing some new things. One thing is this concept of digital twins. We can talk about that, which is interesting. What are some of the other things you've been working on?
Yeah, from that, there's a whole point of maybe thinking about how we can do better documentation, specifications, and maybe like industrializing DevOps. Ooh, that sounds really scary for people. So.
Do I have to wear a hard hat and steel-toe boots for that?
Yeah, it helps.
Probably.
Yeah.
I can imagine a hard hat and steel-toe boots would come in very useful in those weekend all-hand meetings in a boardroom where pizza's being brought in. It would help break out the windows a little bit easier, I guess. Yeah.
So what did you find out about documentation? That you need to write it?
No, I think what So when I started my career, right, gray hair, all that stuff, we couldn't release anything before we wrote the documentation. And then I think at some point, the industry decided that executable things over documentation, right? Agile. And we kind of threw it overboard. Like, yeah, documentation. Just look at the code. That's kind of the answer I get these days. What's interesting, I think, is there's been some work about annotating parts of the things we do. Like when you create like an API, right? You start creating a spec. And that spec, you should start seeing that as documentation. And it's not a UML diagram anymore, but it's kind of serving a purpose of a shared knowledge of what we're using. And similar to UML, we're trying to use this documentation also to generate new parts of it. So it's probably more of an observation than something that I found out. But I see people getting excited again about documenting architectural changes, ADRs. I was like, okay, that's good, right? We're writing these things down again. And it feels almost that this is, we talk about, especially in DevSecOps, of it needs to be in the workflow of the developer because otherwise it will go out of sync, it will not happen. And concepts as diagram as code even are helping. I think the other day, even GitHub started having diagrams to be able to be embedded in their kind of pages. So is there a revival of this? It's just an interesting observation that there's a recurrence of this theme happening. I don't know what you've seen or how that resonates with you.
To me, what is interesting is that the documentation has to change drastically, in big part because in the past, I think that we were more siloed. So if you're working on infrastructure, you're documenting infrastructure for you, yourself, and your fellow infrastructure experts. I'm using infrastructure as an example, right? The same thing, documentation for your Java front-end application, whatever. Traditionally, we were not really focusing much on infrastructure, on documentation, in a way how that documentation can be used by people who are not working directly, not experts in that specific thing. Mm-hmm. But now we are removing those silos, or at least trying to be more cooperative between different groups. And all of a sudden, that puts additional stress into documentation, because I'm a huge proponent of read the code, right? But that works only for the things I'm deep in, right? If you tell me, read the code, there's a Terraform manifest for your infrastructure. That's all I need to know, really, because I'm very familiar with Terraform.
Yeah.
If I give the same answer to developer who should be able to spin up infrastructure by himself or herself, that's not a valid answer anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Because that person does not understand subnets, kind of. Nobody understands subnets, right? Except people who are really deep into AWS.
Yeah.
So it kind of needs to refocus documentation, maybe even going back to the roots. In the past, a big part of documentation was focused to the end users, right? Kind of we were making guides. How can users of our desktop application actually use that application? Normal people. I think that we need to go back to that, except that now the users are others in the company.
Yeah, I think that's often when people say the old style of doing DevOps, right? Or system administration, it was called at that age, right? They would think about how they would build something and then here, you can use it, right? They're not thinking about who's using it, where they're using it for. And I think one of the shifts of mentality while we were talking about DevOps was the fact that there's a kind of self-servicing from others. And so if you think about it, whatever we're starting to build and others are using it, that is exactly your point. We're having users. We're not doing this just for ourselves, right? And that means we're following the same path of like, oh, we're writing documentation so somebody else can use it. It's definitely a bonus, as a sign of maturity of a project, when there's something there that you can read and that makes sense. But it's tedious, right? It needs to be kept in sync with whatever we do in a change. I always hoped that somehow, when I first heard about GitOps, right, I thought it was actually more about capturing the conversation and the discussion of the knowledge we're creating at that point than it was about the approval process. But I think that's where the real value of the GitOps comes, is that you have that conversation and that shared knowledge, but I hardly see that turned into almost like the artifact of a documentation or a decided step somehow. Anyway, maybe I'm overthinking this too much.
No, but I do believe that is a huge problem of GitOps, right? GitOps is great in terms that we know where we keep stuff. That's great. Everything is code. That's absolutely amazing. And then nobody but you, everybody can find where what you did is, and nobody but you understands what that something is maybe a slightly better thing, but not really still perfect. Because if you look at, I don't know, like Kubernetes manifests, I mean, if you're not specialized in Kubernetes, nobody understands them. That's the reality of it. So how much better it is that that's something that nobody understands is stored in Git is, to me, questionable. I mean, it's definitely better than storing it in your laptop, right? So I'm not questioning the usefulness of Git, but yeah, I can go. I mean, for some people, let's say infrastructure manifests are equally cryptic as to me would be if you tell me, here's Rust code. I never saw Rust code. I never used it. You can show me as much of it as you want. I still have no idea what it is.
There's another part of this, how we're building things, that kind of documentation and why we made certain architectural decisions. And then there's, similar to what you said, the usage of that information or documentation. When I was looking at digital twins, which is a term that is used in factories and the industry, more about visualizing what goes on in the physical world, and they try to make this a virtual representation. In that world, they talk a lot about specification. So if I have a screw or something, I can read the data sheet and it contains everything that, like, if I put too much pressure on this, it will do this. I need this kind of tool. This kind of documentation I'm sometimes missing somehow. And let me give you an example. I have an app and I go to one of the cloud providers, let's say AWS, and I say, okay, I coded this app. How many CPUs do I think I need per user? I need to guess, right? And then I do the same thing on another cloud provider. And then again, I have to guess. And so everybody has to almost do the same benchmarking of their own app. Like, sometimes it feels there has to be a better way that we can say, like, if you do 20 GET requests and 70 and a payload of 20K, we can have a calculator that says, like, oh, these are the specs of our thing. It will overflow if you do 1,000 because internally it's an Nginx and it kind of like explodes or something, right? But that kind of like specification, it's somewhere deep in kind of the pages of an AWS. It says, like, oh, you know what, asterisks, there's a little limitation here, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of like the usage, how we build this, and then kind of the exceptions or kind of the environment on, like, what are the use cases, which is another part. I don't know how, but it feels we're lacking there compared to the industry in some ways. Maybe we can't be standardized and we all believe we're special snowflakes and yeah, or maybe the vendors don't want us to find out what the spec is, whether they're better or worse than other vendors, and they make it really hard to compare the specs. I don't know.
At the end of the day, vendors are motivated by what their customers are asking for, right? Maybe we are not vocal enough. In that example with AWS, maybe you did not actually express your dissatisfaction with not having the information that you have, and then nothing will really happen.
So what would help them? Being more vocal about it?
Being more vocal, I guess. Because that's really what motivates, I think, vendors. I mean, at the end of the day, motivates them that you're a happy customer who is going to renew a license or whatever the payment method you're using. And very often we're silently unhappy
Yeah.
with what we experience.
Maybe you have to show the pod. Like I like in a way that how Kubernetes, let's say an ingress point, right? There's like 50 plus ways that you can run an ingress point. So maybe we should like somehow express almost like the diagrams of the components saying like if you use this or that, then it kind of makes it different. And then the vendors would come around and say like, oh, but we can show you better benchmarks or I don't know what. Like it's kind of turning it around somehow in that way. But also for ourselves, like, do we need to spend more time explaining what we built, maybe what the limitations are? So that's kind of another part on the documentation as such. But
it also depends who the audience is, right? Kind of when you say explaining better, are we talking about explaining better so that if tomorrow I leave the company, somebody else comes in my place, he can continue the work? Or explain it better in terms of the end users, right? If it's the latter, I still do believe that, yes, documentation is the problem, but it's more that we are still not making easy for users to do something. I mean, the ultimate goal should be that other engineers using your service, whatever that service is, create a virtual machine, should be as easy for those users as it is for, I don't know, people to shop at Amazon.com. There is no explanation required, right?
Yeah. But even there, you probably read, the reviews. You read kind of what are like specifications, your guess. Again, it's like one of those things. I also already feel that we're putting so much burden on everybody. Like when imagine the whole industry would now say documentation is the holy grail. I was like, oh, we just got security done. Like that we need to get started. Like now another phase. So. I guess it's like how many things you can pressure on people, what first, everything first, right? So it's like your head explodes in that way.
I'm talking now from the perspective of a person who works in a startup. Mm-hmm. And what you just said is actually the main cause of the issue is that there are so many things that we are all yelling about that at the end of the day, people almost choose, okay, so I know that I cannot do make it secure and document it and do this and that, and then we almost randomly choose. Kind of,
yeah.
Hey,
today I feel like documentation. Let's do it.
Exactly. I know that I will not do. I know that everything that needs to be done will not be done. So that's a given, right?
Yeah.
So let's choose one of those things.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like bug triage. Let's pick the one we like most today.
Yeah. I mean, you can see that by number of issues. If you go to some successful open source project, right, and look at the history of the number of open issues, it's always growing. It's never falling down. It's not like a year ago you had 300 open issues and you closed 500 and only 400 of new ones were open. No. It's just the depth is just increasing always.
Yeah. But I guess it makes sense, executable working first. But after that, there's a lot of things you can do, right? So it's to build better metrics in there, do the right documentation, do a tuned performance. We can keep on and on and on. But it reminds me of a talk I heard about two of my heroes in kind of the agile world, and they were discussing things, and exactly like you, they say, oh, and they were now applying this in a startup. And it's like, the stuff we talk about is so hard to do right. Like if you need to take everything into account. But yeah, it's I'm not saying digital twins or any of the industrial parts will kind of save us, of make our lives easier. For me, it is just interesting to look at what we are doing in our industry with a different lens. Like, can we, another thing I found was, imagine you have those 3D diagrams of a house, and a house has the walls, and then they have the screws and all kind of those components. So you can visualize this in a kind of 3D exploded way. You see all the components and they hang together. It occurred to me that let's say in a Terraform or a Docker or other parts of our things, we kind of seem to lack a way of grouping things more logically together. Imagine you would say, visualize my cloud infrastructure, and it would treat every part equally. There's no way of kind of grouping or like logically reducing the overload instead of having this whole diagram. And that's interesting to me because it's something they've tried in the industry to kind of like make components, and we would call them abstraction layers, but we can't make them kind of, let's say, conceptually or for the human to be better understandable. We make them for the code, but we don't make them for the humans to better understand what we do in that way.
Yeah, to me, that what you just said sounds similar to what I said before, that we tend to make documentation more for ourselves than what you just called human, right? Which would be everybody else, right?
Are you sure, Victor, in your case?
I mean, I know that what I do is understandable only by me. And I can bring witnesses to that.
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, it's that grouping, and then I one of the other things I explored that was funny. Every 3D visualization I've seen from a cloud infrastructure, the first reaction of everybody is like, "Oh, this is so cool! This like node graph. This is eye candy," and then nobody's able to use this. And we're dealing with increasingly more complex environments, and it would be interesting to see how somehow we kind of like break through this barrier of dealing with these complex components and picturing them in a better way. I saw these games, Minecraft, and build Kubernetes clusters, or you have your Kubernetes run inside Doom and you kill all the processes. Okay, it's a child play, but yeah, there must be something there to visualize or drill down. Maybe it's more of the observability or like debugging that we lack these concepts as well.
What you just said is interesting. I never thought about it. 3D visualization. Why is nobody doing that?
Well, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe there's a lot of explosion around cloud diagramming these days.
Yeah.
Definitely. And kind of like auto-discover. But I think where they all lack is it blows up when complexity increases, and they don't have a good way of dealing with this inside of those parts. It doesn't have to be 3D. I found out there's something called like 2.5D, which is conceptually called like isometric kind of visualization. It's sometimes used in games where it's not 3D, it's not 2D, but you kind of have this pseudo effect in a way. But one of the things I found in the study was that they say a good diagram in that way has somewhere between maximum of 5 or 7 concepts on the same diagram. So all the other parts need to either be removed or be abstracted or some way. So that hence I came to the idea like, okay, how can we group things together so it doesn't overload, when we look at things. But the annoying part is that when we look at only 3 or 5 or 7 concepts, we feel that we're missing out. We're not seeing the big picture. So it's like, how do you relay the big picture, the small picture at the same time? Those drill downs. I don't know. It's probably drilled down in a lot of the observability tools. Like I said, is interesting because you jump from one concept and then you go up again at a higher layer. I always have unfinished thoughts, so don't think it's going to work out. Like, I never believed DevOps was going to be a thing. So.
But a whole industry is sort of popped up around it.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. It's just an accident. So.
If you only had 1/10 of 1 penny every time somebody said DevOps,
Yeah.
we probably wouldn't be having this conversation because you'd have your own island somewhere.
Yeah, it's what my kids tell me. Like, why didn't you trademark this, buddy? We wouldn't be sitting here. No. Anyway, it was a deliberate choice, actually. I remember talking to, I think it is Ward Cunningham, who trademarked the word wiki. And he was sitting somewhere, and he said, like, now I'm dragged into those meetings where every time a company wants to use that term, I have to give an approval. It's like, this is hell of my life. I'm never going to make that mistake again. And it's the same thing, like, oh yeah, DevOps, and yeah, you get like, but anyway, I think that's part of why it grew, because you had like, well, you see whatever you think about, it's like Hudson and Jenkins, right? Like, okay, try to control it, and then poof, it's gone.
Exactly. Especially in our industry, where we come up with new names for the same thing every second week anyways.
Yeah. But yeah, it would have, imagine you would say like, oh, you can't use the word DevOps anymore, like, because it's trademarked. You see all those marketing teams scrambling. It's like, oh, we need to rewrite. But didn't that happen as well with GIF, or as well that you can use it or something with the...
It was the file format that I can't remember who the IP company was.
Unisys, right?
Unisys, that sounds right. Yeah, we are really showing our age now. And by the way, is it GIF or is it GIF?
Oh, come on.
We have to pay 5 cents for every time we say that.
Probably.
What else is going? So your documentation. Okay, let's pause on documentation again a minute. What kind of tooling? You brought up the GitHub thing, and that's actually a blog post that we talked about recently, and it's using Mermaid, using that syntax.
Yeah.
What other documentation tooling are you seeing right now that's making you go, this is interesting?
Oh, damn. No, I have to think of the name. So there's a conceptual thing around writing documentation, which is, I think, the concept of C4, which is a way of grouping things, but much lighter than UML. And I think structurizer is one of them. They're trying to use that kind of way of grouping things to make that into diagrams. And there's now a spin-off, but I can't come up with the name. But I'll send it to you in the show notes. I think it started off as a Kubernetes cluster visualizer, and they realized the complexity. Like I said, it wowed the people in the beginning, and then nobody was able to use it. And now they're using it for creating diagrams and cloud diagrams in that way. But anyway, sorry that I can't come up with the tool. But
are you trying to say that we already got with Kubernetes complexity so far that it's more complex or more difficult to represent than cloud?
It's not more complex, but I think what they initially tried to do was auto-visualize the whole cluster with everything that's running, and they moved it to use the same techniques, but you visualize what you find interesting. So it's a different thing. Yeah. So it reduces a lot of the complexity because you can put whatever you want in there.
That sounds like a right direction, because if you take something that is very generic, building blocks more or less, which cloud is, right? Essentially, AWS is a bunch of building blocks that until you assemble them into something, it doesn't mean much. That does mean that any attempt to make it generic works for everybody is going to end up with what you mentioned before, kind of, there's a bunch of stuff here, 57,000 different concepts. You figure out what really matters here. What should be zoomed in and what should be zoomed out, right?
Yeah. I was just looking it up. It's called the first version is called Structurizer, So the structurizer.com, and it uses the C4, and now there's a new one, but I'll find it shortly to build on that. But yeah, I think in one of the other talks, they also related it to say this. When the person was actually, like I said before, building components for the medical industry, and they were creating like this AWS blueprints. And also they found is that whenever they created a blueprint that contained too much components, people will just not build it. So they would have the same problem as visualizing the number of concepts and making it there as well. I think another interesting research topic, if you're into that, there's a whole thing about reducing visual complexity. And there's a whole research field around that and reducing graphs and kind of how they group things. But anyway, I'm still wrapping my head around this. But I think whenever you would now search diagrams as code, which is kind of the term, a lot of it is coming around. And then there's products that are spinning up around that. I'd like, just because I like to play with 3D things, like I would love to have this like in a 3D fashion where I could zoom in, zoom out, have somebody else point this out to me, how that works. And also, I wonder if there's a way that you could, I know, this sounds like weird, but like how you can experience an infrastructure collapsing or something. Like imagine the haptic feedback when things crash or something. I don't know. It's just like fascinating field.
So basically you're saying in the future, SREs will just be wearing VR glasses and they will be running around a virtual data center like we used to do back in the 80s and resetting and pushing the power button again.
Well, the nice thing is there won't be a running anymore. So
that's true.
No. I think it's just exploration around like, is there a benefit? Because it's rule one of any 3D visualization. Is there a third dimension useful of doing this? We don't have the location as in the physical world, but maybe the grouping is one way of, you enter one chamber, you leave another, you zoom in, you zoom out. Is there a benefit from that? Is there, like in a game, is there a benefit of having a map as the overview? And then you can kind of dig in, go in and go out in that perspective. I don't know. I haven't found research really working on this. I saw a few capture the flag things that try to explore this in a gimmicky way, but we're nowhere there yet, I think. But, Tom Cruise alike, we'll like assemble Kubernetes components together, and then all of a sudden it, will be hanging above the ground. Anyway.
Suspended on 4 wires. Yeah, what you're just saying is, I'm visualizing it, and you've already said it, is I'm just seeing the original Doom maps going through my head, all 8-bit Doom, and
yeah. Doesn't it feel sometimes like that?
It does.
I can't just see the problem. I need a bigger bazooka.
No, I like it, especially as I'm getting older. So the more I can move in that virtual world sounds better.
Yeah.
What do you do when you can't kill them and you've run out of health? I mean, what do you do then?
You buy Bitcoin.
Is that when you're getting a new job? Is that when the CV's updated and off?
You sell that as an NFT, as an unsolvable problem.
Yeah. All right, I'll ask you, what's your take on this whole... Well, okay, blockchain is not NFT.
No.
And NFT is not blockchain. Mm-hmm. So let's leave blockchain out of it, because I believe there are some legitimate uses for blockchain.
Mm-hmm. But NFT is one of the usages of blockchain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your take on all of this?
I think, I have 2 sons who have been debating this at my table with opposite views. One is a creator, and he loves it because it kind of gives them the idea that he will get a revenue for what's due to him. And the other person thinks that is just a waste of energy and time as such. So I have to be, as a father, somewhere in between, not taking sides. But I think as an artist, there is this notion that I should be paid what what makes sense. And if something gets resold, then I would have a part of that. On the flip side, I think my son made the argument, that probably heard it somewhere, but he said, when somebody sells something I made for a lot of money, I could whine about this, that it's not worth, that I didn't get a lot of this money. But that person said, who sold it, like, imagine me selling this for a huge amount. What would that mean for your next creation? And that immediately creates the fact that, I would be able to sell my own now for a lot more than I would initially have thought. It's a different mechanism. The fact that we now record all the changes and we use smart contracts to do payouts, fair enough. I think we've been stuck in maybe too long of bureaucracy of saying, the collection of rights and payments, they have been maybe not fair in our sense, that it's been slow. It costed a lot because it was slow. There's a lot of new and things evolved, and this kind of democratizes it. So in that way, I'm all for it. The discussion about using resources and energy, that's a whole different thing. But the fact that there's a faster feedback, more transparent feedback where things land, it could be, but on the same hand, it couldn't be. Like, it could be on the black market because it's untraceable and anonymously. And at the same time, it could be tracked and officially if that gets known. So like all good and bad, all technology can be used for good and bad. And I can see, again, legitimate uses. I'm definitely not against it. I would be fun to sell every bugs and every deploys as NFT. That would give me a lot of money. But anyway, so it's a mechanism and a technology, and I don't see inherent good and bad in the technology, just in the uses. So
exactly. I mean, it's at this point, with my limited understanding, I cannot imagine how we will not find very good usage of blockchain in general. Just that the main problem I see right now is that it is mostly focused on selected few people who are exploiting it in a way, right? But one could argue that that's what's happening with everything new, always, right? Same thing like conquering America, Wild West, or internet in the early ages, kind of. If you ask somebody, I don't know, 30 years ago, what is the usage of internet, they would give you a very different example than they're giving it now.
But yeah, it's I found the other day somebody asked me, we can't control security in the Web 2.0. Are we ever going to be able to do it in a Web 3.0 world, right? But I think my response, besides saying, okay, it's technology good and bad, there's some interesting uses, right? The bill of materials, the recording of things in the Bitcoin chain, like making that immutable. I've seen another one. I think the Bitcoin system, which is an interesting one, the Bitcoin client, or I don't know how to call it, the Bitcoin agent, they use a concept called consensus builds to verify whether it was the build they should distribute is actually the build they say it is. So what they do is they have everybody build the same binary, and because it's a reproducible build, they could say, if the majority approves that this is the checksum of the build, this is the build. So you imagine this as a solution to solve the tampering of code during the build. If you have your same build running on Circle, not anymore Travis, but anywhere else, and they're giving the same results, then you kind of know it's like maybe you could. It's not an absolute, but it's an interesting approach of the distributed building as such. And the third example was a streaming company called LivePeer, and what they do is encoding is expensive in a way, and they are incentivizing people with GPUs to do the encoding for them. And so when you do a good encoding, you actually gain money from that. So, but it's a distributed way of solving the scarcity of resources by having a crowd actually fulfill this resource in a way. Anyway, those were kind of interesting uses that I found for the blockchain that will help us overcome some of the problems we have today.
So it's immutable and multiple entities need to verify something, right? You're describing it. Pull requests.
Yeah, but it's a different thing. There's an approval process. Yeah, okay, you could kind of like see it in a way. But
well, I think the difference with Git is not everybody's keeping all of their nodes, if you will, up to date. Whereas in blockchain, that's how it works. Everybody's always reaching consensus.
Yeah, but there's about, what is it, like depending on the system, about 10 or 12 minutes or
right.
40 seconds, or there's no
lag.
Consensus, and then there's a lag, right? So yeah.
Now, could we set up Git servers to do that for us? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is it done today? Mostly not.
No. I think what I learned, like one of the things in my 3-month learning period, like there's a couple of flaws in a way that in many cases, the blockchain itself will need, I think in the concept, they call it an oracle, who would kind of translate things happening outside of the blockchain as a verification. Did that event happen? Yes, no. So it's kind of like this outside approval or kind of oracle that says like it's good or it's bad. But the danger of that is obviously if that gets controlled by one party, like is it decentralized again? Or like yeah. For example, if you would be the encoder and only one party says yes or no, right? Is that really a good thing?
This is now a question from me that shows that I don't really understand how that works. But its approval process is decentralized. But as long as there is no central authority that owns majority of the compute power, right?
Yeah. They
kind of
this,
nothing really prevents Google from doing 50% of compute, right? Mm-hmm. And realistically converting it into centralized. I mean, it's still officially not, but
yeah.
Okay, we've wandered all over the place, and we're really close on time. So, Patrick, we want to thank you for being with us again on this yet another Divide by 50. And while y'all were talking, episode 200, as long as everything happens normal and we don't miss a week, will be March 1st, 2023. All right, so Patrick, you'll come back on February to record, and it'll come out March 1st. I also did the math for episode 1000. Episode 1000, if we don't miss a week, is June 30th, 2038. Now, I didn't do the epoch math. I think that's after epoch, which I still want to write a book about the coming epocalypse. Never mind. Bad joke.
Okay, I'm going to make a public statement. By that time, I will be retired. If I do the episode, that would be from some retirement home or something like that.
Well, yeah. Again, I was doing my math, and I said I was going to be 70. I'll actually almost be 72. I'll be just a couple of weeks from being 72 at that point, in June 30th, 2038.
But yeah, they see it like by then we'll be replaced by synthetic actors recording this themselves. So,
Well, we could already do that today if we wanted to.
Yeah.
The problem is we have to actually write it all out to begin with, and I don't want to do that.
A little bit of GP3 and we're good. So.
It'll be GP12 by that point, right?
Yeah.
But more importantly, by 200 episode, next 50, we expect you to trademark Devops.
Yeah. Okay, it's a pipe dream. It's a waste of global resources energy.
It would take a lot of Bitcoin probably to go ahead and get that trademarked. Okay, Patrick, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.